This is kind of like Inception here. Seeing all these comments here. Look at that. It just goes on and on. Oh, this is kind of fun. Oops, I accidentally paused it. Can anyone tell me what this is an example of? Casey, do you know what this is when you see that? I'll come back. Okay, so first thing we're actually going to go over, if you looked at the link on the announcements page, actually, sorry, it's right here. The announcements page, where are we? Announcements. And we look at the announcement for today. I posted an FRQ from 2016. And this is the question here. And then we have a scoring guide. And then we have 2 sets of student responses for those 2 questions. And we're going to go over those today, looking at both the responses and how to grade it. So you have a better sense of how you're going to be assessed on this exam. I don't think it's going to be all that different this year, even though the format has changed. I think the assessment on the FRQ is going to be relatively similar. Okay, so just in case you didn't figure it out, this is an example of recursion here. It is a physical example of recursion, but essentially you can think of it as the stack going down, right? It keeps calling itself over and over and over again in a loop, and the loop is slow enough that we can actually see it in progress, and you can watch that mouse slowly moving from one screen down to the next one as it gets a longer and longer and longer tunnel. And the longer I sit here, the longer that tunnel will be. And that is the recursive calls and stack. Okay, so let's get into this. I'm going to start with, question 3. So if you haven't already answered the crossword puzzles, or at least taken a look at it, I highly recommend taking a look at it, thinking about how you would solve this, or attempting to solve it completely before we go on to this step. But let's go over the question really quick. So the question is essentially this. You're going to be making a 2D array. And again, 2D arrays aren't going to be on our exam, but this gives us a good idea of how to answer the questions and how you're going to be scored and assessed. So it uses everything that we are going to use on the exam and more. But it doesn't mean that it's doing things out beyond, or it is doing things beyond our exam. But it's like the example I gave yesterday. It's not like a history class where, we say that the French Revolution isn't on our exam. So why are we studying the French Revolution? It has no relevance. Studying 2D arrays has complete relevance to working with 1D arrays. If you can work with 2D arrays, working with 1D arrays becomes easy. It's like studying calculus to take an algebra exam. If you know calculus, you better know algebra to be able to do it. Okay, so enough justification of why we're doing this. Here it is. So the question is, you're going to build basically a computer representation of a crossword puzzle like this. And so it goes into explanation of the 2-dimensional array and what the rules are about how to positively number our array. So the square has to be white in order for it to be numbered, and the square does not have a white square immediately above it. And that's basically what the answer we need is. Sorry, getting a... So you see that it can't have... I'm sorry, what is it? Sorry, I just got a text there. Or does not order white squares immediately to its left or both. So we can see, because it has no white to the left, that's why it gets a number here, even though it has a white square above it. So there's several constrictions, or constraints rather, on what can be labeled. And those constraints actually make our life easier. So this shows us what our available classes are. And this is going to be very much like the second question, likely, that you're going to use. I'm going to guess, and I don't know, but I'm going to guess that the first question is about array lists. or arrays, since that generally takes more time. And the first question is going to be using something like this, where they give you a small Pojo class, which is a plain old Java object that just holds some piece of data and usually has a quick setter or a getter, like this square class. And you're going to use that somehow. So let's get into the next part of it, which is the crossword itself. The crossword itself has a puzzle 2D array, and it has this constructor that uses a 2D array of black squares to determine where the black squares are. And we can use the square is black and the integer number that will go along with it. And to be labeled will also give us some. We're going to actually create that in part A. So part A says, write a crossword method to be labeled. The method returns true if the square indexed by row R, column C in the crossword puzzle grid should be labeled with a positive number according to the crossword labeling rule. Otherwise, it returns false. The parameter black squares indicates that squares in the crossword grid are, or in the puzzle grid, are black. So the class information for this question, they give you a lot of the class information that you're going to need right here. And then we get the what it returns. So we know we're going to need to return a Boolean. And we know that we need to take in and use this black squares and iterate through it. So right here, we're going to talk test taking strategies. Let's think really quickly. It gives us two main lines here. Returns and the square R row column is black if and only if black squares R row column is true. So right here, we know that we can score free points by simply writing a return at the bottom of our page here. If you're completely lost, write a return at the bottom and say returns true. Okay? Just write that down there. And then you know that you're also going to have to loop through black squares. Okay? Anytime they're going to give you a list, anytime they give you an array, you're going to have to loop through it. I guarantee you. So write a loop. Write a loop even if you don't know what the logic inside of that loop is. Add some space between your lines, so don't smash your lines together when you write your for loop, so that you can write logic if you can come up with some new logic. Writing those two things, writing a simple return statement and writing a loop, will likely get you some points. Let's see if there's any questions that have come up yet. We'll see a recursive call. Not yet. My other laptop that I was using to monitor the live stream before is in the middle of a Windows update. So this is why we're doing the live stream monitoring that way. Okay, so this is our first question. Second question on part 3 is write a crossword constructor that should initialize the puzzle grid and have the same dimensions as the parameter black squares. Each element of the puzzle grid should be initialized with a reference square, object, appropriate color, and number. The number of positive squares to be labeled 0 if the square is not labeled. So here's another big hint. Assume that to be labeled works as specified. That tells you immediately that you're going to have to use that method. They don't add a lot of extra stuff in these questions. So you know, at some point, you're going to, like, if you're completely in the middle of here, right, in the middle of this page right here, write a to be labeled method and pass it the appropriate parameters, which are a row, a column, and our black squares array. Okay, so crossword, black squares is already there, and you're going to pass it a row and a column. Well, how about this? You already know to be labeled because row and column are going to have to change, right? So great. Let's create a loop and let's wrap that to be labeled inside of a loop. And we know it's going to be 2 for loops, right? Because it's a 2D array. So you're going to use 2 for loops stacked inside of each other. One tracking rows, the other one tracking columns. And then you pass that into your to be labeled method. You do those 2 things. Create your double loops, use your to be labeled, right? And it's a constructor, so we're not returning anything. Don't make the mistake of putting a return statement here, right? Because it's a constructor. There's no return value between public and crossword. You do those 2 things, I can almost guarantee you're going to get points. Okay, so now it's on to question 4. Let's go look at our student sample responses. You can pull this up. It's in Canvas, student sample responses right here for question C, Q3 right there. So you can pull this up and look at your own copy, or you can follow along in the video. So 2016 general scoring guidelines. This has not changed for 2020. So this is a general scoring guideline that are penalty points and non-penalty points for all questions. Okay, so array access or collection access confusion. So if you confuse a list with an array using either mixing up your brackets or your get method, that's minus a point. Is code that causes a side effect, that's minus a point. Don't write extra code if you don't know what it's going to do. Local variables used but none declared. Declare your variables, right? You lose a point if you don't declare them. Deconstruction of persistent data. Do not change anything that's passed in, okay? Keep data that's passed in whole. Add it to something else. Generally, you won't have to do much to it. And avoid a void method or constructor that returns a value. So just as I mentioned right here with this constructor, if you accidentally return something, you could have answered the question completely right. And if you return something, you're going to get minus points. Pay attention to whether or not you're working with a constructor or a void method and make sure that you're returning the proper value or not. Extra things that don't have penalties. Extraneous code with no side effect, right? So if you write some extra code that doesn't do anything, no problem. You wrote extra code, but as long as it doesn't do anything that creates a real problem, you'll be okay. Spelling or case discrepancies where there's no ambiguity. That's important, right? So don't name things the same name, but change up capitals when you're writing your code for an AP exam. That's okay practice when you're developing professional code. When you have an IDE that can catch those mistakes, don't do that on the AP exam. Name things clearly differently so that you don't lose points. Local variable not declared provided, and other variables are declared in some part. I don't even know what that means. Local variables not declared provided. Other variables are declared in some part. Oh, basically, I think what they're saying is if you... Not declared provided. Not declared. Local variable not declared provided. Other variables are declared in some part. Okay. There needs to be a comma after that declared there. So basically what it's saying is as long as you declare your variables in some way, at some point, you'll be okay. Declare them where they should be declared, right? Private or public qualifier on a local variable. You don't need those inside your methods. Most of these questions are going to be inside methods. You probably don't need private or public. Missing public qualifier on a class or constructor header. You may be defining a class or a constructor. It looks like they don't care if you miss public. Keyword used as an identifier. They don't expect you to memorize all of the identifiers. We know the common ones. Try to avoid them to avoid confusion. Common mathematical symbols used for operators. Okay, so you can use all of these. Don't do it because you're doing it on a computer. Don't do it. Do the proper Java. Confusing your brackets versus parentheses versus braces. No, what are... I forgot what the name of those are. I call them carrots. These are brackets. Those are parentheses. These are braces, and curly braces are the other one. So those are braces. Using single equals instead of double equals. Please don't do that. Really simple mistake. Don't do it. It can cause confusion. Even though, yes, you don't get an error for this, or you don't lose points, don't do it because it can cause confusion. Length versus size confusion on arrays, strings, list, array list, with or without parentheses. So you're safe on that. Extra brackets, that's okay. I and J instead of I and J. You guys should know this difference using 2D arrays, but we don't have 2D arrays, so it's not a problem for us. Extraneous size of an array declaration. Size equals new int size. We don't need it in the beginning here. You only need it on the second one, but you won't lose points. All of these you will not lose points for, okay? I'll let you read through the rest of that list on your own. Basically, it's just about brackets. Let's get to the specific question. So, this is... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at question 4. Let me look at question 3. That's question 4 again. There's question 3. Okay. Question 3. Here we go. Question 3. Return a Boolean value indicating whether the crossword puzzle grid square should be labeled a positive number. So +1 checks black squares. So as we said, if you create a loop that goes through black squares, you automatically get a point. Okay, you didn't have to do anything else, just loops through black squares. Checks black squares border above, black square border to the left, and no bounds errors. So this is basically the logic inside. Returns true if a square should be labeled with a positive number. Returns false otherwise. So if your black squares is close enough, you might get that return true extra point, right? You may not, but you may also get it for having that extra return statement. You won't lose points by putting that return statement. Crossword constructor. So equals new puzzle. Access all locations in the puzzle. Remember, we talked about creating that double loop that goes through it. Calls to be labeled. Look at that. With appropriate parameters, you get 1 point just for calling that method with appropriate parameters. You can have no other code. So if you have no other code, you could score a 1, 2, 3 points, right? You score 3 out of 9 points with no other code, without even getting close to solving the problem. And on these AP exams, scores are super low, right? Because these are complicated exams. Getting 3 out of 9 can be the difference between a 4 and a 5. Okay, so that's 3 points that we talked about without even understanding how to solve the problem. We just looked at the instructions and said, this is how we can do it. Then we have numbers identified squares consecutively and all the other things that are for logic. 3 free points there. Specific question, specific penalties, consistent uses of incorrect name instead of puzzle. So you're using the correct name of puzzle or variable for the 2D array that's storing the puzzle, and uses array.length instead of array num.length. All right, so we need to have our array at a specific spot and finding its length. You can get -3 points there for using the wrong code. Okay, so now we look at our correct sample solutions. So the first one is to be labeled. So this one packs everything into a return statement using our good friends of logic and short circuiting here. So if not black squares, right? So black squares is holding our booleans here. So if it's not a black square and our row or column does not equal 0, and our black squares are -1, so checking, or this is checking to which direction? That's checking to the left, right? Or checking above column -1 is not a black, then we return our number. So this checks that it's not currently a black square, checks that it's not in the top corner, right? It checks that our black squares or there's no black square above, or if there is a black square above, and it checks for the black square. I'm sorry, this is to the left and this is to above. So this is checking all of those spots and returning the appropriate value for to be labeled. Okay, part B, building our puzzle. So another thing we can say here is another free point is talking about building that puzzle. We know it's a constructor, so we would have had to build that puzzle, and we know we're going to have to build it this way. This is a little bit more complicated. We're building it as the same size as black squares. Again, we aren't even talking about logic yet. We're just building the backbone of our answer. So puzzle is going to become a new 2D array that we create here. Then we have those two loops, our nested for loops that I talked about here. And we're going to go ahead and go into